In 16th century Scotland, one of the most important issues in the country was the marriage of their queen, Mary. This marriage was going to determine the future of Scotland and potentially the future of others as well. Mary was young, beautiful, and a queen. She was also next in line to the throne of England and had plenty of options. Of course, there were questions on the role of religion and the type of person she would marry. Was he going to be Catholic or Protestant? Was she going to marry an independent prince with a kingdom of his own, or possibly a prince from Denmark or Sweden? There were multiple suitors, but politically she had her eyes set on Don Carlos of Spain. The son of Philip II and the heir of a vast kingdom, a marriage to Don Carlos would put Mary in a powerful position. But he was rumored to be mad and prone to violent outbursts. Knowing this, Philip would discourage a marriage match, as he eventually had to disinherit and imprison him. There would be more suggestions and more names, until one day an Englishman sailed to Scotland. Henry Stuart, more commonly known as Lord Darnley, would sail to Scotland in February 1564. It is not known if Darnley specifically sailed to Scotland to woo Mary, but his mother Margaret was ambitious and had sent Darnley to France after Mary's first husband's premature death. Darnley himself was ambitious, but he was also young, handsome, and a bachelor. And when Darnley arrived at the Scottish court, he would be treated like the important guest that he was. Mary did regard him as a suitable candidate for marriage, but this was mostly because of his English and Scottish royal blood as well as his religion, and not for any emotional reasons. But in April, things would change. Darnley would fall sick, and Mary would take the role of caretaker. This seemed to be the event that would result in Mary falling deeply in love. She would visit his bedside constantly, reading to him and providing him with comfort. Caring for a feeble and weak Darnley brought forth a series of romantic feelings that she could not shake. Mary had fallen in love and was going to marry Darnley, and no one was going to convince her otherwise. This intense infatuation would have far-reaching consequences, ultimately leading Mary down a path of upheaval, loss of her crown, and nearly 2 decades of captivity under the English. The moment Mary's engagement became known to Elizabeth, disapproval was swift. Darnley's bloodline traced back to Henry VII, granting him a claim to the English throne, though a weaker claim than Mary's. Elizabeth thus demanded his immediate return to England, but her call went unheeded. While Mary did not require Elizabeth's endorsement, her vehement opposition posed a significant challenge. Darnley, now proud that he was the chosen husband of the Queen of Scots, became increasingly intolerable to most Scottish lords. But Mary was head over heels. People would say she was so in love that Darnley must have bewitched her. With Mary being determined to marry him, he would provoke anyone, knowing that they dared not retaliate. His behavior would become so outrageous that even his closest friends couldn't defend him. Mary's half-brother James Stuart, the Earl of Moray, viewed the engagement with gloom. Moray was a very influential noble and did not want to see a Catholic family rise and gain influence. He was also worried that his own influence would diminish. This would lead to him briefly rebelling against his sister and reaching out to Elizabeth for support. But Elizabeth would rebuke him for rebelling and would only offer him asylum in England. But this wasn't the only thing Mary was dealing with. She was soon losing attraction to her new husband. Darnley never took the business of government seriously and would much rather play with his fife or go hawking. Darnley would also constantly complain about not being given the crown matrimonial, meaning that his authority and power as king would be equal to Mary's. This could only be done by an act of Parliament and with Mary's approval that Mary would not give. But Darnley, with an inflated sense of self-worth, firmly believed that the entire country supported him. Darnley's headstrong belief that he should be the rightful ruler of Scotland would lead him to a path that would ultimately destroy him. Scottish lords were very familiar with Darnley's beliefs, and instead of telling him otherwise, they would simply fan the flames. This was because they had a scheme up their sleeve. They believed that Darnley would be much easier to control than Mary. And during this period of Scottish history, the lords would frequently change loyalties due to religion and family feuds. They decided that in order to get Darnley to betray Mary, they would have him assassinate her secretary David Rizzio by convincing him that Mary was having an affair. After this, They would arrest Mary for treason and give Darnley the crown matrimonial. And on March 9th, 1566, all would go as planned. Patrick Ruthven would burst into Mary's estate in Holyrood and say he was there to restore Mary's honour. Accompanied by Darnley, he would then accuse Rizzio of having an affair with Mary and that it was time for him to answer for his indiscretion. Mary would deny the accusations vehemently and ask her husband if this was his doing. As Darnley remained silent, Ruthven would launch at Rizzio and signal for more men to enter the room. As the attackers swarmed, Rizzio desperately clung to Mary's skirt, pleading for his life until the very end. They would then imprison Mary and threatened her harm if she tried to escape. But her husband Darnley would feel sympathy for his wife and return the next day. Pleading with him, she would manage to convince Darnley that the lords were just using him and that they would eventually get rid of them both. Darnley, worried that his wife was right, was soon persuaded. They would then escape Holyrood together, seemingly reconciled, but Mary was bent on revenge. Furious that Darnley had betrayed them, the lords involved in the Rizzio conspiracy would be determined to destroy him. Darnley already had few friends, and his double cross would lead to him having even fewer. Mary would also never forgive her husband for his role in the conspiracy. But Mary was also facing upheaval. She had alienated some of her early supporters, specifically the Earl of Moray, an influential Scottish lord, by deciding to marry Darnley in the first place, and now there were even more lords of questioning loyalty after the Rizzio plot. Darnley and Mary were on shaky political ground. Instead of solidifying her hold in Scotland, her marriage had simply weakened it to a dangerous degree. As the months continued, things did not improve. Darnley's antics would remain relatively the same, and they could no longer tolerate each other. No longer trusting Darnley, Mary was quick to believe rumours that he was trying to destroy her. And as Mary refused to be near him, Darnley would move to Glasgow, where he had family and supporters. The conversation would turn to divorce, but in the 16th century, a divorce between a king and a queen was often difficult to achieve. Seeking to undermine any potential conspiracy, Mary would ride to Glasgow and convince him to head back to Edinburgh with her. At the urging of her lords, Mary believed that she needed to keep a close eye on Darnley. This was exactly what the Scottish elite wanted. Still seething from his double cross, they had made the decision to get rid of Darnley once and for all. But they could not do so while he stayed in Glasgow. Needing to bring him back to Edinburgh, they would persuade Mary that the closer he was to her, the less of a risk he would be. Their plan was to ultimately create an explosion at Kirko Field, where Darnley was staying. The Earl of Bothwell, often perceived as the chief conspirator, would have a servant gather gunpowder and store it in the Queen's chamber while Darnley was away. Then, at a later time, while Darnley was sleeping, a servant would return and light the fuses. On the fateful night, however, Darnley sensed something was wrong. Awakened with a sense of dread, he would look out his window and see mysterious shadows. Fearful that something was afoot, he would climb out of his window and attempt to flee for safety. Unfortunately, he was spotted. After being chased down and surrounded, the conspirators would strangle him. Hours later, the explosion would go off, but they could no longer hide what was now obvious. Darnley had been intentionally murdered. Mary's initial reaction was shock and horror, but this was largely because she believed the explosion was meant for herself. As more information began to come in, it became clear that Darnley was indeed the intended target, and the crime was orchestrated by members of the nobility. In the aftermath of the murder, Mary would show perfect correctness during the initial mourning period, but Darnley's death and her following actions would ruin the Queen of Scots. The decision to marry Darnley had been catastrophic. Believing that she did not need to listen to anyone's advice on who she should marry is understandable, but Mary needed the support of her nobles. It was not wise to ignore them. She did not have strong family connections either, as she had grown up in France. And any religious alliances she could have had were squandered when she decided to satisfy the Protestant majority instead of Catholic loyalists. She would also alienate her half-brother, the Earl of Moray, along with his friends and supporters. Darnley's character also did not gain her any friends. Instead, his personality, arrogance, and boastfulness made her enemies. Her unstable marriage and his death were filled with multiple schemes, double crosses, and assassinations that any monarch would have trouble dealing with. Darnley had become a liability not only to Mary, but also to the nobility. Her marriage would embolden them to undermine her reign, and despite their early failures, they would continue to scheme and plot until they finally succeeded. And ultimately, after Darnley's death, Mary, depressed and now completely at a loss on what to do, changed course and fully embraced the decisions of her nobles. But unbeknownst to Mary, the nobles were not in agreement, and though they signed a pact supporting her third marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, they would immediately rebel after the marriage, claiming that Mary and Bothwell had Darnley killed when in actuality they had conspired with him. And after multiple battlefield losses to the rebelling lords, Mary would flee to England, unaware that what lay before her was 19 years of imprisonment and eventually her execution.